Hi, I'm Attorney Ramsey Bahrawy, and this is Your Money, Your Life. Today our topic is caring for a loved one with serious memory loss, confusion, and language difficulties, which have been diagnosed as dementia. Today my guest is Alan Holbrook. Alan was a caretaker for his wife, Bernadette, who at age 57 was diagnosed with Alzheimer's disease. As a result, Alan has made it his mission to educate the public about Alzheimer's disease. Alan, welcome to Your Money, Your Life. It's great to have you on the program.
Thank you for having me.
Now, we're going to talk about how it feels to be a caregiver for a spouse who's been diagnosed with Alzheimer's. But first, could you explain what symptoms your wife had and what led her to get medical treatment?
Well, there's a very common phenomenon amongst people who are dealing with Alzheimer's, becoming caregivers, or being the person with the disease. And that is, like so many other things, hindsight is 20/20. When you get to the point where you start suspecting dementia, then you look back and you realize that over the last couple of years there were unexplained things that, if you had been more aware, would have led you earlier to the idea.
What kind of unexplained things?
In the case of my wife, and very commonly amongst most people, they were memory issues. My wife would simply not recall that we had agreed to do something or that she had said something to one of the children. And it was very confusing for her and for us. And it just progressed to the point where finally we realized that there was something wrong. We didn't know what at the time. And we started seeking medical help and diagnosis for a number of potential causes. As
your wife went through the medical investigation, at some point she would have then been diagnosed with dementia, isn't that right?
That is correct.
What was her reaction and what was your reaction to that diagnosis of dementia?
Well, her reaction was fairly severe in that, of course, anybody who knows anything about the kinds of dementia that we're talking about knows that it is a death sentence these days, that there is no cure. In my wife's case, there was an additional factor in that her mother, my mother-in-law, had passed a few years before from Alzheimer's. My wife had been her primary caregiver, so my wife knew what she was in for, more than a lot of other people did. She knew exactly what was going to happen to her.
So your wife wasn't shocked by the diagnosis, was she?
She was shocked only in that she had been in denial leading up to the diagnosis and just didn't want to acknowledge the possibility.
As her husband, what was your reaction?
When we actually got the diagnosis, by the time we got to that stage, I was pretty sure in my own mind that this was what we were going to hear. So yes, of course, it was a blow when I heard it, but it wasn't, I wouldn't call it a shock at that point. I had sort of prepared myself for it.
And was any treatment prescribed for your wife's dementia?
There are treatments, and she had certain medications prescribed for her. All the medications available 10 years ago when she started into her course, and still today, are all things that are only intended to delay the onset, to slow down the process. So you can call it treatment in that it helped symptomatically, but it wasn't treatment as in, okay, we're going to cure this disease. There is no cure.
Dementia, most common as Alzheimer's, is a progressive disease. It gets worse over time.
Yes.
And as you mentioned, there are medications that can slow down that progression, but it doesn't eliminate the disease altogether.
That's correct.
At some point, you decided to become your wife's caretaker. Why did you decide to become the caretaker, and did you know what you were getting into?
Well, in the first place, becoming a caregiver is not something that you normally decide on. One of President John Kennedy's most famous quotes, a reporter asked him, "How did you become a war hero?" And he said, "It was simple. The Japanese sank my boat." I became a caregiver because my wife was diagnosed with Alzheimer's. That was what I had to do. So it wasn't something that I felt I chose to do. As a matter of fact, that was one of the parts that I really resented the most, was that, you know, I would say to myself, hey, I didn't sign up for this. But the fact was that I did sign up for it when I stood up in front of that preacher and said, for better or for worse, sickness or health.
So for how many years were you your wife's caretaker? Are we talking, a few months, or talking a year, 2 years, 5 years?
Well, from diagnosis until the time she needed skilled nursing care, which means going into a nursing home, was about 5 years.
Okay.
Now, during the first couple of years of that, I was indeed her caregiver, but I could still go to work. I still could hold a job. I'd get up in the morning, shower, shave, put on a suit, go to work, come home, and be reasonably certain the house would still be there, the cats would still be around. As she progressed through, it became more and more obvious that this was going to take more and more of my time.
Okay,
And
can I stop you
yeah.
right there? Could we go back to the first couple of years? What kind of things as a caregiver did you have to do for your wife in the first couple of years?
In the first couple of years, it really was not all that burdensome. It was mostly taking over activities that she was starting to have difficulty with, like being almost totally responsible for the house, for cleaning, for cooking, that kind of thing, for doing the laundry. It was making sure that she knew where she was and that there was somebody keeping an eye on her when we went out. But it wasn't the kind of thing where I necessarily had to be 100% vigilant 100% of the time. That came as she progressed through the disease.
Okay, so tell us how your duties as a caregiver changed.
Well, as a person progresses through Alzheimer's, and medical and healthcare professionals usually talk about 3 stages: early stage, middle stages, end stage. Early stages are what I was just discussing, where mostly you can get through these things. There are only a few minor problems. When you start getting into middle stages, there are things that require more attention. I used to describe it to friends as being the single parent of a special needs student. There was still a personality, there was still somebody in there, but they weren't capable of governing themselves, of making their own executive decisions, of exercising good judgment. As an example, when my wife was still at home, we went out one night to a department store because she needed some clothes. She picked out some clothes, went into the women's changing room, and didn't come out for a good 10 or 15 minutes. I was right on the edge of, I don't care, call security, I'm going in there. She came out, we discussed the clothes, she went back in. She couldn't remember which changing room she had been in. Again, I was on the verge of going in when a good Samaritan, a woman who was already in there, who must have had some experience with this kind of thing because she obviously knew, pointed my wife in the right direction. But those are the kinds of things. You have to start paying full attention to where the person is. You have to start paying full attention to every decision they make, to everything they want to do. You have to make sure that they don't wander off. Another very typical incident that happened to us, and has happened to many, many other people in slightly different flavors. When my wife was still at home and still relatively ambulatory, we decided to go out to the Big E, the New England States Exposition out in Springfield one year. We were in one of the halls of the States, the Connecticut Hall, and my wife had been walking slightly behind me the whole time at the fair because she was trying to key off of me, which meant I had to continually be turning around to make sure she was still there. And I stopped at one exhibit and turned around, and she wasn't there. In just those few seconds, she had wandered off. Fortunately, I carried pictures of her. I went right over to the state troopers' desk, showed them the picture. They found her relatively quickly. But those are the kinds of things that do happen. The person becomes less and less able to manage their own lives.
Let's talk a little bit about managing one's day. You were talking about executive function. We all plan our day and we manage that day. Is that something that your wife could still do, or was it something you had to do for her?
Again, it was a matter of what exact point in the process are you talking about. There did come a point where I had to take over all of that. I had to get her up in the morning, get her cleaned up and dressed. I had to take her down and give her breakfast. Even got to the point eventually where I had to feed her breakfast. I had to settle her into some sort of activity, usually just sitting mesmerized in front of the television while I did the work that I needed to do around the house. Fed her lunch, took her upstairs in the evening, got her cleaned up, showered into her nightgown, put her to bed.
What about going to social events or family type events? Is that something, could your wife interact with people at these types of functions?
For quite a while, yes. In the early stages, of course, those executive functions and those decision-making functions are not too badly compromised. She still knew who all her relatives were. And my wife was always a very family-oriented woman, loved family functions. So she not only could do them, she looked forward to them. There did eventually come a point where she stopped remembering who certain people were, couldn't follow conversations, and it got more and more difficult for her to go. We still tried to involve her in things up to the point where it just became obvious that she didn't know what was going on.
How did that affect the other family members that she wasn't able to interact with them?
Well, there's two aspects of that, actually. Immediate family, and this is a sad part. My children, because my wife was diagnosed relatively young, our children were still relatively young. They were in high school. They stopped bringing friends home. We had one of those houses where there was usually, 4 or 5 kids after school, hanging around our house. My kids stopped bringing them home because they never could tell what their mother might do, and it was terribly embarrassing to them when she would ask the same question 4 or 5 times within a space of 10 minutes. When she would come downstairs, not totally clothed. Right. So it really affected the children quite a bit. And that was probably my biggest regret in the whole episode.
As Bernadette's husband and as her caregiver, how did being the caregiver affect you?
I usually tell people that caregiving is probably the single most stressful occupation a person can be in. Because suddenly, the very life of another human being is your responsibility. You have to be aware of where she is at all times so that she doesn't fall down the stairs, so that she doesn't burn herself on the stove. And the other aspect of it is that you are watching the person you fell in love with, the person you married, the person who is the mother of your children, slowly go away from you, and there's nothing you can do about that. So both of those aspects, having to do the job, having to watch what is happening, are very, very stressful. I tell people, if you want to drive a car, you have to take lessons and pass a test.
Right.
If you want to fly an airplane, you have to take lessons and pass a test. The only requirement for becoming a caregiver is you have somebody who's ill and needs help.
You're right. There is really no training for being a family caregiver.
Actually,
right.
There is training. But the problem with the training is you don't usually find out that training is available until you have already started becoming a caregiver.
Until you're already in the role.
Right.
Yeah. You're absolutely right. Being a caregiver to your wife, did that affect any other parts of your life at all?
Oh, absolutely. There came a point, as I think I mentioned earlier, where I had to quit work and stay home and be a full-time caregiver. And I enjoyed my career. I had a fairly successful career in middle management in the computer industry. I had intended to work for many, many, many more years. But it became obvious that she needed somebody at home. There was not a lot of other immediate family in the area. So again, it wasn't something I chose to do. It was something that fell to me.
Sure.
And so that was a major effect. Another major effect is for most caregivers, it's very difficult to get out on your own. So maintaining social contacts with people that I knew and hung with, you know, that I'd call a friend and go out to the bar and have a drink or two in the evening. Most of that stopped.
Were you able to take a break from your caregiving duties? Was there somebody to step in so you could take a couple hours off, like you said, and go out and have a drink with somebody, or just have quiet time
in a
to
while
yourself?
there was. Now here's another phenomenon that's recognized in this kind of situation. Quite often, other family members are always there with lots of good advice telling you what you need to do. But when you ask them for help, they're way too busy.
Yeah.
That kind of thing happened to me. The best that I ever got, my wife had a friend she had known for longer than she knew me. Friend lived down on the Cape, and every once in a while, not often, maybe once every 2 or 3 months, would come and get her and take her away for a weekend. That was heaven.
Yeah.
That was incredible.
So it gave you a break.
Yes.
It gave you a break. That's
Yeah.
good.
Yeah. There are still remnants of strains between me and members of her family that I asked for help, and oh no, I'm sorry, I'm really too busy.
Yeah.
We haven't been able to mend all of those bridges.
Wow, that's a shame.
Yeah.
That's a very
It
real
is.
shame. Now, did you have to do any compensating for the fact that your wife had this dementia as the disease was progressing? Did you have to kind of compensate for the fact that she couldn't remember certain things, she couldn't do certain things, or would you just do everything for her?
Eventually, it came to the point where I simply did everything for her because it was easier on me to know that I could and probably should do these things.
Yeah.
And that's not necessarily the best thing, wasn't necessarily the best thing for my wife, because there is usually still somebody home in there. There's usually some function left almost to the very end. And anything that excites that involvement, that, you know, exercises those functions, is good for the person. But in a practical reason, you know, it wasn't, gee, honey, would you like to try to cook dinner tonight? I'll help you with the recipe. It was, why don't you go sit and watch TV? I'll cook dinner.
Now, you know, we all have good days, we all have bad days. Did your wife fall in that same category? Would she have good days as well as bad days, or were they just all bad days?
No, there are good days and bad days. It depends on how you define good and bad, of course. Eventually, again, in the mid to later stages, a good day was a day where she wasn't anxious or agitated about anything. A good day was a day when she accepted whatever it was I helped her to do or needed to help her to do. On bad days, people with a dementia can be very excitable. They can be almost paranoid and untrusting. They can engage in some pretty bizarre behavior. Inhibitions fall by the wayside as dementia progresses. So my wife, who was a conservative Yankee New Englander who you joke about taking a shower with a raincoat on, wouldn't hesitate to walk downstairs totally unclothed if there was somebody else in the house. You know, things like that had to be dealt with.
Did you have any specific frustrations with regards to your role as a caregiver?
I don't know that I could identify any specific one. I mean, life was just a series of frustrations. It's very, very difficult for somebody to truly understand what dementia means. I mean, all of us probably know somebody that we'll look at and say, you know, that guy's a real idiot.
Yeah.
But we still expect rational behavior out of that person.
Right.
There's no guarantee of any kind of rational behavior out of somebody with dementia. If you remember your Alice in Wonderland, the Mad Hatter's Tea Party, he lifted the lid on the teapot and there was a dormouse in there.
Right.
Well, with dementia, you might lift that lid, there's a dormouse in there. You put it back down. The next time you lift it, there's a half-eaten ham and cheese sandwich in there. The next time you lift it, there might even be tea in there. But it's not necessarily because that's what belongs in there. That's just where the wheel stopped that time. So the hardest part about the whole thing is remembering that you're not dealing with somebody that you just automatically assume, that all your life you have assumed
Right.
knows how to think, knows how to reason. People with dementia do not.
Do you have any specific hints for future caregivers who may find themselves in your position?
Yes. Get help. And by that I mean there are support groups available all over the place. There are groups like my beloved Alzheimer's Association that can offer advice, medical advice. They can offer advice on how to cope with these particular things, but definitely a support group. I joined a support group. There were probably 7 or 8 of us who every other week got together and talked about what each of our loved ones were doing, and others could offer hints about, oh, if they do that here, you can try this kind of thing. These people became family. We used to joke with each other and insult each other and pick on each other unmercifully, but if anybody from outside had ever tried that, we would have torn them apart. It was, again, like family. And for me, I think that was probably the major thing that got me through this whole thing.
Where does one find this type of support group?
For a start, the Alzheimer's Association's website has a page that lists all of the support groups they are aware of in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. They list the support groups, they list a contact, they list specialties that these support groups are for. By specialties, I mean, for instance, my case was not necessarily the most common, caring for a spouse.
Yeah.
Most people are adult children caring for an aging parent. My wife had what is technically known as younger onset Alzheimer's, Alzheimer's that affects somebody before 65. If you're in that situation, there are specialized groups. If you are in any other situation, there's almost always a group that is specially designed for that. If you're more comfortable, there are single-sex groups, there are ethnically oriented groups, but they're all listed, and you can get in touch with people and find out how you can get them on board.
Today, you're dedicating yourself to educating people about Alzheimer's. Talk a little bit about why you're doing this and what is your mission.
Well, it started out of the frustration you asked about earlier. It started out of not knowing where to go for help, not knowing what help was available, going to places where I thought help should be available and it wasn't, particularly in the case of somebody at the time with younger onset. I would call a state agency or somebody associated with a state service agency and say, you know, gee, I need some help. Can I get transportation for my wife to her doctor's appointments? Oh, yeah, we can take care of that. We provide that. She is 65, isn't she? Well, no, she's not. I'm sorry, she's not eligible. All of that has changed with legislation and such. But living with that frustration in varying degrees for 3 to 5 years just made me realize it's sort of like a John Wayne combat movie. He's the grizzled old sergeant, and there's a new recruit, and he takes the new recruit under his wing and teaches him the ropes. If you can find a guide who can help you through some of those paths, it makes it so much easier. And I guess basically what I would say is I started doing what I do to pay it forward. It has since become much more than that to me. Being involved as an advocate, being able to help influence our elected officials, legislation, all becomes sort of an end of its own. This is something that needs to be done. In the United States of America, there are over 5 million people with this disease, and somebody is being diagnosed with Alzheimer's every 67 seconds.
And you know, with the baby boomers retiring, and it being the largest generation, we're likely going to have more people than ever being diagnosed with Alzheimer's.
I don't recall the exact numbers here sitting with you. I usually have them documented when I'm presenting, but Alzheimer's is already the single largest financial drain on both Medicare and Medicaid. It's in the billions of dollars today, and by 2025, it will be in the trillions of dollars. And you nailed it.
Yeah.
It's we boomers.
Yep.
It's we boomers. 10,000 people are turning 65 every day in this country.
Yep. It's going to be a major
Yes.
problem, and
Right.
and obviously our policymakers are going to have to figure out how to handle this thing.
Yes, they are.
Good place for us to stop. Today we heard from Alan Holbrook, who cared for his wife after she was diagnosed with a debilitating disease called dementia. She lived with the constant threat of losing precious memories, such as life events, the names of loved ones, and a confusion that interfered with her ability to carry out tasks we all take for granted. Although many people think they understand dementia, they really don't have a nuanced understanding of what it actually means to live with dementia. By sharing his firsthand experience as a caretaker, Alan has given us an up-close and personal picture of a person's journey living with dementia. A journey that has tremendous effects not only on the patient, but also on her caregiver and family. As an advocate for people living with Alzheimer's disease, Alan's message is that society can no longer afford to turn a blind eye to this serious, debilitating, and terminal medical condition. Rather, it is critical that our society better understands this illness and reduce the stigma surrounding this awful progressive disease. In closing, thanks to my guest, Alan Holbrook. Alan, thank you very much.
Thank you for having me.
And as always, thank you to you, our viewers, for watching Your Money, Your Life. My name's Ramsey Bahrawy, Building Your Trust.